climate crisis. How do we get out of it? We're just going to let everybody kind of log on and get their Zoom sorted out, and then we are going to get started with a really important program for all of you. So thank you so much to everybody who's logged on so far, and we'll get going right away. All right, I think we are ready to go. So, welcome. Thank you very much, everybody, for logging on today. Like I said, this is the Climate Convergence webinar, Capitalism Caused a Climate Crisis. How do we get out of it? And we're really thankful for everybody for taking the time today to participate and join us in this really important discussion. I'll get into the thank yous with all the speakers as we go through. But before we started anything as far as the program and logistics, I wanted to invite Coast Salish Elder Kelly White to welcome us and to start off the webinar in a good way. So Kelly, I think you need to unmute yourself, and then yeah, we'd love it if you could welcome us.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay. Oh, careful when you say that. Witnesses here. HYLCM, in the highest of your honor, we're thankful. We thank you in our language, in the highest of the honors. It's the way to acknowledge. Acknowledgement is so much. So it's an honor to be in your realm, CIM, in the spirit of ancestry within your realm. And we're grateful that you've answered the call today, those that are participant and panel, to speak for our sacred rights to life, our rights to life, whereas all that are living cannot speak for ourselves. So we're thankful that the panel is out today and the organizers for putting such strong voices together for this evening, and participants to involve knowledge with questions and participations this evening. You won't be the same. In regard to the thousands, the millions of our people, 300 million people in the world that have not sacrificed, but were robbed of our lives for the profit of the colonists to our worlds. We honor them, the millions that did not come out of the profit of climate that is causing the murder of the sacred Mother Earth and through climate change. We also remember those that are not living on the earth, the trees, the lungs of the earth, the swimmers, the ones that the four-leggeds, the ones that are swimmers, and they can't speak for us either, but they do in realms in the way they are appearing to us where we haven't seen them before. So we're thankful for this moment of time. To cherish the knowledge that is before us for this small few hours, that we'll be able to enhance our strength with our amongst ourselves, our belief in our own work that constitutes the faith of keeping climate justice safe, climate of the blanket of the Mother Earth safer than we've been, hurting her daily by the flick of the switch. We're thinking of those that are fighting the pipeline in the north, center, south, east, and west with our eagle song. There's no one flies higher than the eagle. And we thank you for taking the challenge, to taking the knowledge on your backs this evening. And with this song and the speakers and the participants tonight, we invite your messages to be on that eagle's back this evening after we close, that those messages can be delivered with Creator's will and unfold as our truth in the justice, creating a semblance for justice for climate change. Our eagle song of Haida Gwaii. How language of our Haida families. Hachikasi language of our Salish families. Pelami language of our Lakota families. Hi. In language of our Cree, of our Plains families. And we thank you in our colonial language for all that you are, mind, body, and soul, without want and need to help us create justice for climate change. Haichka Siyam for the honor of your time. And we anticipate your messages with great enthusiasm, and we anticipate the participants' participation and knowledge sharing as well in the short few hours that we have treasured this evening. Haichka Siyam, all my relations.
Right.
Over to you, Chairman and ladies of the panel. Haichka Siyam.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We are so grateful and fortunate that you're able to participate in so many of our webinars, and also for all the lessons you've taught us over the years. Before we get into the rest of the webinar program, and I'll explain the order, we also need to acknowledge and make sure that we center that May 5th is also Red Dress Day, a National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And that we know that there are at least 4,000 or more missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada in the last 30 years, which is about 133 a year or 3 a week. And that 2 years after the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that contained 232 calls for justice, the Canadian government is still spending millions for more fighting Indigenous people in court against their rights. And the RCMP refuses to release how much money it's actually spending investigating these ongoing cases. And that is something that is a shame, and that in a country like Canada that calls itself civilized and advanced and puts itself out as a leader for the world, is something that I think really leads into why we decided to organize this webinar in Canada. That we live in a system, and we live in a world, and we live in a country that's broken, and that there's a lot of things that we need to fix. And we're here to do our best to educate ourselves and to organize around these issues. So thank you everybody for coming out tonight. The way that we've organized the webinar, first of all, my name is Thomas Davies. I'm an organizer with Climate Convergence Vancouver. And the way that we've organized the webinar today is we'll have 3 speakers. We'll start with Jennifer Nathan, and then Lee Maracle, and then ALISON BODINE. That'll go on for about an hour. and then we'll open it up for question and answer. So there is a question and answer box. You can type questions in as you go. There's also a chat. You can type your questions and answers in as you go. If you're watching on Facebook, if you type your questions or your comments in the chat box there, we will do our best to get everything together and consolidate it and make sure that we can try and address this. One thing that we're very aware of is we do a lot of webinars. This is the first webinar we've organized, which is kind of a bit more broad, a bit more radical politically. And this is one discussion that we're sure 2 hours is not going to be enough for. So if we don't get to everything, and if we don't solve the climate crisis and capitalism and how to defeat it and build a better world tonight, don't worry, we're committed to fighting it, and we're continuing with this discussion and organizing around this and learning and working together to do that. Yeah, this is just the beginning of something that we're working on, and yeah, we're very, very thankful for everybody to come out and participating tonight. So without further ado, there'll be some announcements throughout about how to get involved in climate justice organizing, and there'll be some links that will be provided. We'll also send an email to everybody that's registered for the webinar with the links so that you can follow up on the information that's provided. And we'll also give some information on how to get involved in climate convergence at the end. But before that, let's get in with our first speaker, who is Jennifer Nathan. And Jennifer is a teacher with a science degree in biology and a master's of education who has worked in formal and informal science education. She was arrested in 2018 after peacefully disobeying an injunction relating to the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And she raised the common law defense of necessity in a lengthy trial legal case. Her presentation is titled "The Tar Sands as a Crisis of Capitalism." And I'm really excited for it. She's got a PowerPoint, so she's prepared. And the reason I'm so excited to have Jennifer is that she's somebody that we see constantly at protests and actions. And then she's attending all these actions, and then whenever I talk to her about something, she says, "Oh, I'll send you a few links," and that's like hundreds of pages of research and documentation, many of which that she's written. So I really appreciate that she's someone who is really focused on the details and the scientific reasons, but also make sure that she's active and engaged in organizing, and somebody who, you know, once they understand the truth, I really feel like she feels compelled to act on it, which is very special and important. So Jennifer, without ado, we'll get to you, and then if you could start sharing your screen, and we'll make sure we can hear everything and see it all. Yeah, we can see it. Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
can you hear me?
You're good to go.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Climate Convergence and Thomas, for having me here. Thank you, Kelly, for that lovely introduction. I'm coming from the unceded territory of the Kakite and Coast Salish. And as Thomas said, I was a science teacher and did that defense of necessity case with David Gooderham, who's a retired lawyer, who we've both been deeply concerned about the inability of Canada reconciling its climate targets with the TMX approval and expansion of the tar sands. So on here, you can see this link, gooderhamnathan.com. So what I'm going to be talking about today kind of comes from an analysis of Canadian policy, mostly something called the Energy Futures 2020. I'm sure most of you out there are familiar with the National Energy Board. It's now called the Canadian Energy Regulator. And they just came out with this EF 2020, I'll call it, report. And we're going to take a look at that. So before I get to what they said, I want to show, this is the International Energy Agency. So sorry, I'm a teacher, I'm going to throw some math at you or a few numbers. But this is this is a group that kind of looks at where oil is going, what the demand is going, what the demand is, and what countries are doing based on all of their policies with oil extraction around the world. So if you look at this, we're right now in, let's move this out of the way, 2020. And you can see that by 2030, oil production is going to have increased and increased even more by 2040. So current policies are what governments say they're going to be doing. Stated policies are what they kind of promise, but don't have any strategies or policies to do that yet. You know, I'm sure all of you know what the science says, that by 2030, emissions have to come actually quite far down. So oil must go down if we're, as Kelly said, to avoid that climate catastrophe and keep ourselves safe. So the IEA did look at that, and they've always developed from about 2010, they've always been looking at how can we keep in line with the science? Where must that oil production be? So they call it the Sustainable Development Policy. And you can see by 2030, it's quite far down, but there's a gap between where countries are going and where we need to be climate safe. So that's called the emissions gap. So I'm going to refer to that a bit later. That's where everyone's scrambling to get to, the promises we need to make, the stricter cuts that have to happen to keep us at a temperature that keeps the planet safe. So here in Canada, where do we fit in? Are we trying to go to that emissions gap? What are we saying about our oil production? There we are. So it's a bit of a shocker. We're not actually planning to go down in our production at all. Here we are in 2020. By 2030, we aim to go much, much higher. And by 2050, be producing more oil than we are now. So you probably heard in the November, Canada said we are going to commit to net zero by 2050. So this is a conundrum. How on earth, when the world knows it must come down in oil production, can we increase our production to 2050 and meet any climate policies? So why are we doing this? Well, it turns out that Alberta has 165 sort of proven reserves, billion barrels of oil in those tar sands. That's a huge, huge amount. So we're right behind Saudi Arabia. This is an insane amount of sort of oil in the ground. And the companies just do not want to leave it there. So in 2019, we were taking out 3.1 million barrels a day, or that adds up to 1.1 billion barrels a year. By 2045, when we're supposed to be heading down half of that, we want to go up to 4.3 million barrels a day, or 1.6 billion barrels a year. So more oil in 2050 than today. And then just a couple of weeks ago, researchers came out with a new report, and we'll put a link to that in the chat. It's called Correcting Canada's One Eye Shut Climate Policy. And they did the math that if Canada actually did this, they actually produced all the oil they say they want to produce, what would happen for our global climate budget? So we export most of the oil from the oil sands, and 85% of the emissions from the oil sands don't happen in Canada because we export them, so they get burned somewhere else. So we don't have to count those emissions. But this study did, and they said, if we actually did this and it gets burned wherever it does around the world, we would take up 16% of the world's remaining carbon budget. So a quote from the report is, Canada is indeed a carbon bomb of global significance. So we're like 1.5% of the world's population, but we want to do this outsized expanding budget of using up the carbon. Now we do produce emissions at the production stage of the oil sands, and they did the math on that. If we did actually take all this stuff out, we would be emitting in the year 2050, when we're supposed to be at net zero, we'll still be emitting about 200 million tons of CO2, or CO2 equivalent, which includes methane as well. So again, I don't know how you can get to net zero with this monstrous amount of emissions. So let's look at our sectors. If we're going to let oil and gas go nuts, how are we going to come down in emissions? So we look at all the different sectors here, and you can see that hasn't been a lot of going down in any of them except for this green one. Can you see the mouse when I move it, you guys? Yep. So this is the electricity sector. So you probably know that in Ontario, they shut down the coal-fired electricity. So that's the low-hanging fruit. That's an easy way to reduce emissions. So just think, if we had not gone up in oil and gas, we actually could have come down in emissions as a country, but instead we haven't. We've kept increasing our emissions because all of that decrease from the electrical sector was wiped out by increases in oil and gas. So it is our fastest growth of emissions in Canada, and it is the highest sector in Canada of emissions. So what is it, about 730 million tons or megatons of emissions per year, and we have not been able to go down. So when they decided to approve the pipeline, they actually based it on that, what they call the reference scenario. So that level of production they want to aim at for 2050. So they said, you know, there's going to be this incredible demand for oil. It's going to go up per barrel about $75, hang there for a couple of decades, and we'll be able to produce and increase our production for the next 30 years, as well as the world. Well, what do we know? We know if that happens, the climate breakdown, it can't happen. But then Canada announced that they would do this net zero policy by 2050. And for the first time ever in Canada, in this EF 2020 report, they indicate that maybe the reference scenario won't happen. So they called something, they gave this name to this new direction we might go in, and they called it the evolving scenario. So they said if people actually do take some climate action, maybe the price won't be that high. It'll only be go up to about $55 and then hang in at about $50 for a couple of decades, and we'll still be okay, and we can still do a lot of production. But again, the reference case scenario bets on oil demand and prices staying high and all of us blowing past 2 degrees. It's a deadly, deadly outcome. So this is from the report. In a global energy system that does move towards net zero, global crude oil use is very likely to decrease compared to current levels. So this is sort of an insane statement, because there's no debate, no uncertainty, no credible evidence that oil production could do anything but decrease to get to net zero. It absolutely must. It's a disingenuous statement that there's some possibility it might not have to. It must go down to get to net zero. But in Canada, if you listen to the politicians and the media, et cetera, they don't talk about decreasing production of the oil sands. Have you heard them say about we're going to use technology to make it the most productive, best in the world, and carbon intensity? And that's just reducing the amount of energy per barrel. But when you're exploding in numbers of barrels, that gets wiped out. And net zero oil sands production. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But Sephora Berman was quoted as saying, this is like a smoker going from 1 pack a day to 2, but claiming that they're quitting because they're switching to filtered cigarettes. So that math doesn't add up. Also a quote from the report that it's clear that Canada's more ambitious goals, such as achieving net zero by 2050, will require a faster transition than we've witnessed historically, and faster that's shown in the evolving scenario. So I just want you to remember that this line. If you're like my students, I could quiz you on this later. But what it's saying, so the report actually admits, and this is probably the most truthful sentence in that whole report, is that this evolving scenario, this one where we don't produce quite as much as we initially thought we would, is still not fast enough to get us to net zero. So we must produce even less than the evolving scenario. And it also talks about the evolving scenario is at this amazing pace of the energy system continuing this historical pace of transition. But again, if you've looked at our numbers, we haven't come down. We continue to keep going up. So we signed the Paris Accord in 2015. We talked about, or we accepted the 1.5 IPCC report, which talked about net zero. We've had several years to plan something, but we just cannot transition out of this. So you probably saw this. This is the kind of graph that went round the world when this report came out. So if you go to 2020 here, this dark dotted line is the reference scenario. That's the ideal exploit the hell out of the tar sands scenario. that gets you from 2050 at massive production levels higher than we are now. And all of these lovely blue colors are Keystone XL, TMX, and Enbridge Line 3 in Minnesota. All of them are here and are being built to facilitate this ridiculous level of production. So this, get back to 2020, this red one is what that called the evolving scenario. And look, you don't need any of the pipelines. And then if you remember, what did we say about the evolving scenario? That even it has too much production to get to net zero. So why are we building the pipeline? They canceled TMX. We don't know about line 3, but we definitely do not need TMX. So, and then just to show again how Canada's 2050 plan, it's not really a plan, it is a communication strategy. So this comes out, this comes, why am I echoing all of a sudden? So you guys hear that?
Yeah, you're echoing all of a sudden. 1 second, we're gonna see if we can fix it.
Sorry, okay. So this is, I think I'm okay now. This is taken from that EF 2020. And again, if my students produce this, it's like, what? This is not a policy. You can see there's no numbers that go with any of this. So let's go back to where we are 2020. To get to net zero, an honest net zero, we would have to start plummeting our emissions now and every year, year upon year, an unprecedented drop to get to net zero by 2050. What they say is if we keep doing what we're doing, well, that's not too good, but let's try and aim somewhere in between. But we won't give you any numbers to say what that will be. But for anything above this yellow line, we can meet it by somehow magically capturing all the carbon out of the air to make it so we're still net zero. So they say net zero doesn't mean that you have to be at actual zero. So look at all, we don't know what this is. Is this 200 megatons? We don't know. It could be an impossible number to actually meet. So this is a very dangerous kind of zone to be in, especially when we don't know how realistic it is to actually, or if there is any way to do that. And I'll talk about that later. So I don't know if you heard just a couple of days ago, there was a case in Germany where kids took the government to court and said, you owe us a stronger policy because this downloads the problem of our climate to future well, even just children now, because there isn't the technology to do this, not the scale to do this, not the money to do this, and allows us to eat up those emissions now. So there's another really important article that just came out on Earth Day, April 22nd. So I think Thomas can put a link to that in the chat as well. These are 3 climate scientists that said that this net zero promise is a dangerous trap. So if we had actually, in the year 2000, started to decrease our emissions, we could take that remaining carbon budget and spread it out over a lot more years. So we'd have a gentler time of it, and we'd have carbon budget all the way up to the end of the century. But we didn't. We kept increasing and using up the carbon budget, so that now at 2020, if we don't go up, but we don't go down, if we just manage to keep our emissions steady, we're going to use up the 1.5 budget in 9 years. So we're in a really tricky situation here. And to promise some kind of negative emissions magic, these scientists say is disingenuous. So this is a quote from the article. The time has come to voice our fears and be honest with wider society. Current net zero policies will not keep warming to within 1.5 degrees because they were never intended to. They were and still are driven by a need to protect business as usual, not the climate. And so when you keep hearing all about these use technology to keep doing production in the oil sands, it's digging us into a very deep hole. So what is the narrative coming from government? What do you hear from Wilkinson? I keep thinking he's our energy minister. I forget he's our climate one because he seems to be such a promoter of the oil sands. So he keeps saying oil is not going to go away overnight. So the IEA expects that global demand for heavy oil will continue to grow by 20% by 2040, and we could fill that demand. What they're not telling you is that that puts us over the top on the climate crisis. It's a non-workable policy. So who is supporting that kind of narrative of taking us over the cliff? Well, these are four different articles taken from Post Media in 2 weeks. This is just from the last 2 weeks. So it says, forget climate panic. Not enough Canadians know how important the oil sands are. The oil sands, a uniquely Canadian success story. And then this, again, so who's protecting this narrative? Media, the universities, the courts, the police, CSIS, who come after us as terrorists. Ian Clark, the only thing they say about him is that he's a prof at a university. This article, which is April 21st, a couple of weeks ago, contains in it the line, recent science shows that CO2 is not a significant driver of climate. So as a science teacher, that is a dagger to the heart that could be in a national publication. So we are getting this propaganda lies all over the place. Hard to combat. These are just a few of some of the social media, what they call astroturf groups. So these groups that pretend to be citizens that care, that promote this narrative of oil sands use, that we must use it. I think Alberta won the Brier, but they had to wear I love oil on their coats. This is Friends of Earth. They have 35,000 followers, and they say that sun is the main driver of climate change, not you, not CO2. If you just look on Wikipedia, it tells you it was an industry started group, and yet they get a lot of looks on Facebook, et cetera, followers. People retweet their stuff all the time. But it's not just sort of corporate fronts putting these messages out. Even an NDP premier would not follow the science on the pipeline and spent millions in advertising it to Canadians. So to British Columbians, she said, here in Alberta, we ride horses, not unicorns. Pipeline opponents need to saddle up on something real. So, and then this just came out 2 days ago on Monday. So it's not about oil, but this is what happens when fossil fuels are threatened. So the gas industry is fighting electrification by forming this kind of collective group that's going to start doing all the things you see like the oil sands do. They're going to start a narrative that your electrical rates will go through the roof. They're going to, you're going to get more outages. You demand customer choice. You should contact your legislators. So it says here, natural gas, of course, the fossil fuel, is in for the fight of its life, and they will not go down quietly. I got this email a couple of days ago from Fortis, BC. I don't know if anyone else got it. They are supporting BC teachers, and they want to spark student engagement with a virtual Energy is Awesome presentation. So they have spent a lot of money on curriculum. They say that energy efficient fireplaces are part of our energy future. So I want to give a plug here to a group of incredible students from high schools across British Columbia that are trying to get climate literacy in the schools. It's just not there. Unless you inoculate students against all of this massive corporate and propaganda and media propaganda, it's easier to kind of see it coming and be able to interpret it than to learn something wrong and try to correct it. So we'll put a link to the student group. You can support them to promote climate literacy throughout all the schools. And then by the students, coming from the students themselves. So I just want to end with a quote from the IPCC. So you remember that emissions gap where we need to go to keep ourselves safe, and that it's not in the far future. It's by 2030. If the emissions gap is not closed by 2030, it's extremely unlikely that the goal of keeping warming to well below 2 degrees can still be reached. And we'll already have blown through the 1.5 degrees of warming. So, so Canada is in a very, very, very bad place with its climate policy. I have no idea how they're going to do a 40 to 45% reduction. We looked at the sectors. It can only be from oil and gas. They plan on doing carbon capture for all of their remaining emissions. It's not a good thing. So if you look at the Angela Carter report. You know, they talk about oil and gas being the largest emitting sector, the fastest growing source of emissions. We need a managed phase out. We need to begin that conversation. If you look at our historical contribution, we really owe it to the world to come down very, very quickly. So I think tonight we'll probably be talking about other kinds of strategies. All of them work: divestment, supporting Indigenous rights, arrests. Also, there's 250 members of parliament between us and a really legitimate climate policy. And hopefully if we can get some of them to break with their party, the Liberals, to admit what the science is and what it requires, we'd like to bring to MPs the questions that come out of their own documentation here. So I can put my email in the chat. You can let me know if you'd like to go to your MPs with that as well. So thank you very much for letting me present.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I know you were very disciplined in streamlining your presentation, because I know the kind of information that you have and we're ready to present. So we appreciate that. And if anyone has any questions, yeah, please, Jennifer, put your email in the chat, and also there'll be time for questions after the speakers. And yeah, part of why we thought this webinar was so important is because of that incredible dissonance and disconnect between what especially the Canadian government is saying and what it's doing, and the confusion and the frustration and the anger that causes. And that's something that people promoting right-wing agendas are really taking advantage of and pushing into some really troublesome places. But we want to have our own answers and our own perspectives and put forward a positive vision and like an understanding of why this is happening. And I'm really excited that Lee Maracle agreed to participate in this webinar. If people have participated in previous webinars, I think you're probably familiar that often we read from the introduction to years old, please. That introduction and the epilogue are pure gold, and we really appreciate it. And she's written a lot of books. That one is kind of a memoir of becoming radicalized as a young Indigenous woman, but has participated, written so many books, has really created a really impressive body of work that needs to be discussed and researched, and part of what everybody in Canada's understanding of why we are here and what the problems are. And we're really honored to have Lee Maracle. She's from the Stolo Nation. She's a grandmother of 4. She's a mother of 4. She was born in North Vancouver. And like I said, she's a prolific and award-winning poet, a novelist, a performance storyteller. And I know it's hard when there's someone who's accomplished so much and they're sitting right in front of you, because I want to acknowledge how much work you've done, Lee, but also I can understand that can be a little bit overwhelming to listen to. But just that she's still a mentor for Indigenous students at the University of Toronto. She's also a teacher, she was also a teacher and also the traditional cultural director for the Indigenous Theatre School, where she is a part-time cultural instructor. And Lee, we're really thankful to have you, and we're really interested to what you have to say in your perspective of being involved in this fight for such a long time. So I'll be quiet and leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Yay. Kelly knows better. She knows that bio is from before 1990. I have lived 28 years since then. I'm not going to say anything anymore. Next time you get a writer on board, though, I think you should ask them for a bio, because, you know, I have a great grandmother of 4 and a grandmother of 7, and I have 4 or 5 kids if you count the stepkids and all of that sort of stuff. And then there's all these kids that just love me, like your girls. I have a very long and busy life, and there are a lot of writers in my family that came before me. I think a lot of people think I'm first wave writer. No, I was probably about 4th. Calcer Tennessee Pass, you know who that is. from the Fraser Valley, is a relative of my children, and he has a poem, set of poems called that were translated by Eliwaz Street. Eliwaz Street was considered a stalo by us. She's as white could be, by the way, because we don't think being a stalo has anything to do with your blood. It has to do with your nationhood, your commitment, your sense of community, and the work you do in that community. And Eliwaz translated with Khalsertin Sipas the story of the Hulkmilan people. So she had to learn the language, she had to learn the culture. It's why it took her 20 years. It takes 20 years to grow a human being in Stalo territory. She started at 20, ended at 40, but she grew, and she became the co-author of a text that precedes me. Also, Capilano is one of my predecessors, and he and Mary Agnes, who's not listed as one of the authors, but she was, and she wasn't listed because Indigenous women are not respected. We are to be murdered. And that is the honest truth, and I want to remember that because we're still dealing with that murder. 4,000 in the last 30 years, but 1 million people lived on the West Coast at one time, where we're from, Kelly and myself. 1 million people. We are now somewhere around 37,000. I was born in 1950, number 101 in my family. There are now 1,500 of us, and I think it's because you're not allowed to just kill us anymore, although people do tend to go ahead and do it. But we haven't had as much death in lately as we did before my birth in 1950. I think the last epidemic we endured was the flu epidemic of the 50s. I thought it was 1954. Somebody said 1956. I really don't care what year it was, but we lost 13 of our PhDs. You call them elders. You call Kelly an elder, and I'm sure Kelly doesn't mind that, but she's actually a PhD in our culture. She's a knowledge keeper. She's a person who knows the story of who we are from beginning of time to today. And we are told in school that we came across that ice bridge or land bridge or whatever it was 15,000 years ago. But they found an animal, a mastodon, that was killed by a human being 140,000 years ago, not far from where you and I come from, Kelly. And they're trying to say that, oh, that's aliens stopped and did that. Because this country cannot face that we are intelligent beings that have been here since the beginning of time. And we have a story. I was telling this story with a dancer, a nice white man who's a tap dancer. And he dances for me while I tell our story of the woman who came from Sky World. At the end of the story, this white man comes up and says, oh, that's a true story. I have it in this book. And I said, yes, we remember it. It's 140,000 years old. You guys have to catch up. And so that is where we begin. You know, one of the warnings that Europeans got was by the people of Siksika. I don't know if you know who they are, but they're not far from Lakota. And they said, if you pull up the sage, the temperature on this prairie is going to rise. You will melt the ice in the Arctic, and then the oceans will come up. The water will warm up, and we are going to perish as humans. And then I remember, you know, environmentalists saying we're destroying the earth, and I was laughing because, you know, she's a big lady. She's a big lady, 25,000 whatever at her waist, you know. I mean, we aren't going to kill her, but we will kill ourselves. This has happened before. We have teachings about the environment because in the beginning we weren't careful. and disasters occurred. And when those men told those white men, don't pull up that sage because it holds water, and in the summertime when the sun beats down, the water rises and cools the prairie, and then if you do that, you'll melt the ice. They knew that this had happened before. And now scientists are finding evidence of it, evidence of what Indigenous people have been storying up for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The second thing I want to say, and I want to get to this because there's so much myth on this island, it's unbelievable. And so much falsehoods that's as old as Europe is. But they say that we came from Asia to here. When I went to Mongolia, they told me a story about how they left this island when it started to get cold. And I started to laugh because I thought, well, that's the first sensible story I've heard yet. There you are in Alaska. The glacier is forming. It's behind you. You can see Russia. Sarah Palin's right. You could throw a rock and hit Russia from Alaska. So they're heading to Sibir, not away from Sibir. They could see the mastodons over there. And the stories tell us that. And of course, when we got to Mongolia, we were at a village of about 150 people. And there was 10,000 people there. And they wanted us to touch their children and take their baby spirits home. This woman started to sing a song, and the gentleman we took with us was Denende. He says, I know that song. And I said, well, get up there and sing it with her. I said, here, take the drum we made. At the end of the song, give it to her. So he gets up there and he starts to sing this song. It was one of their oldest songs, and it was the song that carried them across the bridge to Sibir. And they told us that story of coming from here. So we are related to those people, but not the way Europeans think. We have 150,000 year history minimum on this island. And when the Spanish first arrived at Mexico, not Mexico, but Mexico, they bowed down to him. And they bowed down to him because when they left, the people said, we promise to return. They brought the horse from this island to Mongolia and became the horsemen of Asia. And when I saw those horsemen do their tricks, they did them exactly the same as the Lakota and my uncle, who was trained by the Lakota. 15,000 years separated us, but we do not forget. We do not forget. And our songs remind us. So there he is, Angus Dicky Chuan, singing in Mongolian. And the people are crying because they know the story too. We know this story. So when I read in texts that we came from somewhere else and that we colonized this island just like the Europeans, that's an excuse they're using for all the murder and the mayhem that occurred on this island that resulted in the climate disaster. It's a disaster. Now, we aren't getting out of it, folks. We will either remedy that climate disaster or we will die. That's our choices. But we're not getting out of it. We're in this climate. Willy-nilly. If we fix it, good. We'll be okay. If we don't, we won't. But we are not getting out of it. We are in it. And I'm in it for the long haul. I don't have a problem being in it. And I'm not scared of passing away, because you know what our people say, that we go to the spirit world. And if we don't get it right, we have to come back and try again. My people say that people who are knowledgeable and smart have been here many times. That's how you get to be knowledgeable and smart. You didn't get it right the first 10 times. So nobody's shooting to be real smart. That's why we like humility, you know, it's because, oh, if I act smart, people will think I've been here. A lot of times I've got it wrong. But that's the nature of humanity. We were given this mind and will, and we have called it free will. I don't think that's a good thing to call it, because it encourages us to oppose, to abuse, to misuse, and not consider. We believe, as Hakamilan people, that we came here to show how considerate we could become, how mature we could become, how wide our embrace could be. So we say this, and this is an English translation. I was born on the back of the Pacific, a single water drop. I headed for west wind. I saw stardust. I clung to him, and he carried me all the way to Chiam and dropped me down into the waters. Through the waters, I raced for the ocean. 25 miles wide, the Stalo. That is my embrace. Now imagine the life that lives in that sound. You know, some white guy said it's the deepest sound in North America. And I thought, that's a hell of a stick you got, buddy, to measure it. I don't know. But when that glacier melted, it came from Takaranto, where I am right now. It went all the way across those prairies, digging up the trees. They never returned those trees, barely made it back. And then it went across the Rockies. They call them the Rockies because the dirt went from those mountains and into the waters and into the ocean and formed the richest delta in the world, the Fraser Valley, Chilliwack, where those rivers meet. And at the end of that journey, it's 25 miles wide. That single drop of water is me, and the river is the Stalo. In her arrogance, Canada names itself Canada. I think the Haudenosaunee think it's really funny because it means village. A bunch of villagers came, had dinner and stayed. We don't know why. We don't call it that. The river, we are the river. We are the river. We are not different from the river. We are descended from that river. We become that river. We must caretake that river because it is us. It is us. And we must caretake everyone that wants to sit on the shores of those rivers and those waters. Someone asked me one time why I didn't get angry at Europeans for what they did and make them pay. And I said, well, that's not my business. All the people that are here have ancestors. Everyone here has ancestors. Where do you think you're going to go when your spirit leaves the earth? You're going to see those ancestors. And they're going to say, Jennifer, tell me your story. What did you do? And Jennifer is going to talk a lot about science. They're going to wonder what she did. That's okay. You have till all eternity to tell them what you did. They will get it out of you eventually. But that's what our job is. We came here to live a story, and we go home to tell that story. And that story is one of great consideration for all life. All my relations, that's what that means. That's what that means. Great consideration. I teach here at the University of Toronto, and I had a student who said, well, everybody's talking about family, but I don't have a family. Oh, I said, I thought you were Anishinaabe. And she said, I am. I said, well, come with me. And I sat on the grasses and I said, see all these grasses? And I started cutting them, picking one at a time, one at a time. Pretty soon I had a big handful. I said, count them. She started to count them and she got to about 500. She said, there's too many. I said, yeah, those are your relations. Don't forget that. Those are your relations. That's what we mean when we say all my relations. See those trees behind you, my friend Thomas? Every little leaf on those trees is my relation. Every nanometer of skin of that tree is my relation. I am the river, I am the trees, the animals, the plants, the star nations, and I come from a place they call infinity, I guess is the best description. But they say there are two beings in space that are infinitely long. And my son phones me up one day about 10 years ago and he says, Mom, I think they found those beings. And I said, oh, how do you know? And he said, well, they're 3 trillion light years long. Twin beings in space. 3 trillion, well, it's not infinite, is it? If we tell the white man that, he'll say that. That's not infinite. But 3 trillion light years long, you get to call yourself infinite. That's what I say. That's where I'm going, and that's where my ancestors are. And I will return if I don't get this right. We are responsible for every impact we have on every aspect of life around us. And that goes all the way to India. You know, we put on these, well, this shirt's not from India, but, you know, t-shirts. T-shirts are from Bangladesh and India. And, you know, some of those kids got killed making them. And we buy t-shirt after t-shirt, always at Walmart or Joe Fresh or someplace where they oppress children just like us. And they kill them, working them to death. And we say, oh, look what a good deal I got on this t-shirt. And we acquire instead of give. And we are emotional cripples because of it. And then we're going to return to the spirit world and realize, oh my God, look at these people here. I'll just tell you this one little story that Maria Campbell told me. This Métis guy, he dies. And he goes along the road to heaven there. And he sees this man with messy Rastafarian hair and a big jug beside him. And he says, hey, is that wine? He says, yeah, it is, brother. It's a jug of wine. He says, can I join you in a sip? He says, sure, sit down. So he starts to sip and he says, you're pretty brave having a drink of wine with me, he says. Oh, how come? He says, everybody's scared of me. And he says, why? And he points at the fence behind him and he says, oh, my dad runs that place. I'm sorry, but it's heaven. It was Jesus. You're not as Christian as you think you are, I guess. Anyway, we have to think about that. We have to think about where we're going after this. And if we thought about where we're going after this, we wouldn't be so cavalier about what we do here. Behind me is a pair of blankets. We call them robes of power. Robes of power. Because they cover us. They protect us from the rain, from the storms, from the winds. And they envelop us in the love of the woman who made them. Because that's what she puts into them. In this case, it was me. Behind Kelly is her blanket. She puts a lot of love in her blankets too. And she keeps making them. She keeps making them because she is considerate, both of the earth and the humans around her and the plants and the animals, star nations, the clouds, the skies, the waters, the invisible beings, the ones in the root systems of the trees that you can't even see. Kelly loves them. And when she's making those blankets, I heard her talking to my girls who were just children then about all the beings on the earth and how much she loved them. And I heard her sing to them, and they would sing back at her. And then they formed the first women's drum group on the West Coast. That's another mother to my children. Without Kelly, my children wouldn't be co-authors of a book called Hope Matters with their mother. They wouldn't be with me today. They wouldn't be considerate as they are today. They wouldn't have raised grand and great children, nieces, nephews, and they wouldn't love the earth the way that they do. They love this earth more than they can ever love themselves. That's who we could be. That's what's going to eradicate the climate disaster. It's going to take all of these 7 billion human beings with all of their talents and all of their consideration and all of their great heart to turn back all the terrible things that have been created. You know, you go into a grocery store and 90% of it isn't edible. 90%. Who said you could do that? Who said you could just put plastic everywhere? Who said you didn't have to stitch a little blanket instead of get some child in Pakistan or Bangladesh or India to make it for you and have the ceiling fall on them and kill them? Where did the humans get this idea that nobody else matters but me? Look around. Look around. When that wind is blowing cold like it is here in Ontario, it's unusual, eh? It's unusually cold here right now. It's disastrous. There's 65,000 homeless people enduring those winds. And we could have stopped it a long time ago. Watch that sage on that prairie. It's there to keep the prairie cool so the Arctic can ice up and cool the ocean, lower the waters, and then the whales don't have to die. They came to my inlet when I was 4, the whales. And they stood up and they were talking to my great uncle, Dominic Charlie. Probably Kelly's related to him too. Cousin Levin's brother. Those whales told him about climate change. 1954. The newspapers printed the story and laughed at him. What a ridiculous notion that the oceans are going to warm up and animals are going to die and it's going to be a disaster. It's not that far off. 66 years later, here we are. And we are in a desperate circumstance. We're fighting for our lives. We are fighting for our lives and the lives of every human being on this planet. I don't know what it's going to take. I'm not that smart. I probably have to die and come back. I don't know, but I know that we have experienced this before on this island. We remember the disasters that were created. There's a book called 1491. You should all have a look at it because it talks about the disasters that we created. We know these disasters. We did them. We don't have a problem owning it. But Europeans have a difficulty. Even as we articulate the business of science and disaster, we have to be objective. That is, don't take responsibility for it. Don't say it was me, I did it. Don't say it was so-and-so, he did it. No. We talk about it as though it came out of nowhere, out of left field. It's something that is, it is objectified and ensconced in science so that it's not understandable as something we can change. I know these scientific texts, I read them. I find them amusing because they are so far from truth. They are so far from consideration, and they are so far from climate change. And that's what we need. We need to change how we do business here. We don't need all the things we think we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lee. We really appreciate you presenting that to us, and we know also that you're 3 hours ahead where you are. So it's
yeah, it's late here. I'm 7 now.
And I promise we'll get your bio right the next time. I apologize for that. But we're living and we're learning. But yeah, we thank you so much for that. We really
I have about
appreciate
10 books after that bio was written, and a whole bunch more children and grandchildren and whatnot. So all kinds of things that happened. I was like 39 when that was written.
Thank you for pointing that out. So we are back, and that was Lee Maracle. Thank her so much. Please look into the books that Lee has written. You need to read as many of them as you can. We really appreciate her perspective. And that leads into our last speaker, who is ALISON BODINE, who is a central organizer with Climate Convergence. She's a journalist, she's an author, she's a researcher with a focus on environmental, Latin American, and immigration issues. Her articles have been published internationally by Venezuelanalysis, Global Research, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Common Dreams, Orinoco Tribune and Counterpunch. And so ALISON will present, and then I just want to remind everybody we'll have time for questions and answers after this. So if there's something you'd like to ask any of our speakers, they're here. And we look forward to a really engaging discussion on this important topic. So ALISON, your turn.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to Jennifer Nathan and to Lee Maracle for being part of this panel tonight, which, as Thomas said, is really the only beginning of a discussion, or maybe the middle for some of us. Either way, it's a discussion meant for people that are not only here to talk about the crisis facing the planet, to discuss the destruction of Mother Earth, but to organize against it, to fight, to build a better and more just world, and to reverse the catastrophe that is humanity currently faces. And I think that that is the most significant part of all of the webinars that Climate Convergence has had, because although we are in this situation because of the worldwide pandemic, we have remained committed to growing our ideas and our thought and our connections across Canada and around the world as best we could in this difficult situation, and being prepared as we can when we go back to the streets for our local fights here against TMX, against CGL, against the Site C Dam, but also for the larger global struggles against climate change. So thank you all. I think that today, what I'm left with following these two great women is that little pieces of things that I wanted to say have definitely already been said, and I hope I can provide some perspective to tie it together in some ways and to continue our discussion. And as always, to invite people to join Climate Convergence, come to our next meeting, and we'll keep these discussions up for sure. It's really clear, even though I can look out my window here and I'm really fortunate, it's beautiful, it's, you know, there's clouds, like it might rain lightly, it smells wonderful. I'm here in Burnaby, British Columbia, an unceded Coast Salish territory. But it's still clear that the delicate balance between humans and nature is falling apart. The COVID-19 pandemic, which was the result in many ways of the infringement of humans on nature, is just one sign, and one example of this delicate balance. The rift between humans and Mother Nature has reached a critical point, and now we are getting close to a point of no return. As Lee Maracle said, of no return for humans, not of the wonderful Mother Earth that we live on in this rock and space. The melting of glacial sea ice is accelerating rapidly. A recent report in Nature magazine described just how much, when they broke it down between the years of 2000 and 2004, glaciers lost 227 billion tons of ice per year. But between 2015 and 2019, that number was as high as 300 billion tons annually. We're constantly facing exponential curves of the crisis that is coming. The oceans are sick. The International Pollutants Elimination Network and the National Toxics Network just published a report saying that the oceans were on the precipice of disaster. Chemical pollutants, pesticides, plastics, overfishing, the warming of the oceans. Despite the pandemic shutdowns, which initially had people thinking that there might be a dip in greenhouse gas emissions, have shown us that the atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane levels in 2020 continued to surge. And now carbon dioxide is at the highest level in 3.6 million years, at a time when the Earth was 4 degrees warmer than it is today. There is really too many signs, both human and Earth and nature related, that we can't ignore. When it comes to air pollution and climate change, deforestation, species extinction, soil degradation, and the genocide of Indigenous peoples, alongside continued wars and occupations and the mass movement of millions and millions of refugees on this planet. I often, we can think about parts of the world and we know ourselves, and we know our human feelings towards one another, and we know our source of love and our appreciation. And we think about how the world is run, or at least I do, and the decisions being made always seem illogical. They're anti-human. They're anti-development and growth and justice and all the things that I hold dear. But the capitalist system we live under does have a logic: the profit of capital. It's just that this logic is fundamentally incompatible with Mother Nature, because it simply ignores that our planet is made up of finite resources. It ignores this fact and exploits nature continually, and does not renew the resources that it exploits. And that's how we end up with islands the size of Texas made of plastic in the ocean. That's how we end up with the greenhouse gas levels where they are today. And looking towards the Amazon, that's how we look up at get to an Amazon region that's actually contributing more greenhouse gases to the Earth than it is taking away. In simple terms, or in the terms that we use on our banners and have talked about a lot, we live in a world where profits take precedence over people and the planet, where profit comes way before and in front of social need. And it's not an exaggeration, though it may seem trite or something that's often said, to say that capitalism considers everything to be for sale: human labor, human bodies, healthcare, education, and every component of nature can be bought or sold at a profit. It's also not cynical to say that. It's really to understand that if the capitalist system continues, we will not be able to save the planet from destruction. This system is preventing the rapid and urgent decisions that need to be made. When Jennifer was going through the complete catastrophe that is the Liberal government's climate policy, showing us just how rapidly divergent it is from what needs to happen, it's because the system won't let the government of Canada shut off all the pipes, keep everything in the ground, and end greenhouse gas emissions immediately, when in reality, that's what needs to happen. There is a report from 3 climate scientists released recently about net zero and what that means. And they describe how climate change has been a known danger for more than 30 years. They talk about someone named James Hansen, who worked at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And in 1988, he made a testimony in front of US Congress where he presented clear evidence that the Earth's climate was warming and that humans were the primary cause, saying the greenhouse gas effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now. This report goes on to say that the biggest barrier and the reason that nothing fundamentally changed from that moment 30 plus years ago was essentially cost. What that means is that no one was willing to sacrifice profit or able to sacrifice their profit to cut off the pouring of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere 30 years ago. Retrofitting carbon scrubbers was technology that was known. Capturing carbon in other ways is technology that's known. But none of it was implemented because it was too expensive. And now we're in a situation where it might even be too late.
Such a lie.
There's a lot of technological solutions out there, but they're not being implemented. And they will not be implemented under this system, I will go as far to say. For example, US President Biden had a climate plan. It was actually an infrastructure plan. It was presented just a few weeks ago. And former Green Party US presidential candidate Howie Hawkins wrote an article tearing it apart for what it is, exposing its many, many weaknesses and its inability to fundamentally face the problem of climate change. He described, instead, Biden's plan emphasizes greater corporate welfare, subsidies and tax incentives for clean energy that will take uncertain effect at a leisurely pace in the markets. Moreover, it does nothing to stop more oil and gas fracking and pipelines for more gas-fired power plants, or to shut down coal-fired power plants. Without directly saying so, it is a plan to burn fossil fuels for decades to come. And Jennifer's done the work to show that's exactly what Canada's plan is too. For example, we could contrast this infrastructure plan, which is a lot of money. It's $2.3 trillion over 8 years. But we could still contrast that with the US military budget. The US Department of Defense is the world's biggest climate polluter. It's important to continuously mention that missions from military are never part of international agreements or part of countrywide targets. They're considered a necessary emission and are therefore not regulated even under the most stringent of plans. The US Department of Defense, according to research from Brown University, would be the 55th largest carbon dioxide emitter in the world if it was a country. In Canada, the Department of National Defense also makes a very large contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and it's growing. Canada right now is looking to buy 88 fighter jets, for example, all which burn an insane amount of very high pollutant fuel. Not to mention over 1,000 US military bases around the world also introduce massive amounts of pollution and environmental destruction wherever they are located. US President Joe Biden's fiscal 2022 budget is requesting $753 billion in national security funding. That's more than President Trump's last budget by 1.6%. The climate plan, or better called the Jobs Infrastructure Program, is $2.3 trillion over 8 years. Even if that was all for reducing the carbon imprint of the United States. It is still only a fraction of just the 1-year budget of the US Department of Defense. Howie Hawkins goes on further to say that only about $1.9 trillion of this plan is spent on physical infrastructure that could have remotely anything to do with carbon emissions, and explains it's hard to see how even a quarter of Biden's plan's investments would contribute directly to reducing carbon emissions. Yearly, the US military sends an estimated 59 million tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This is the equivalent of 2.8 million cars. And they're not touching that military budget, it's clear to see. Although climate change, another important thing to say is that although climate change will impact everyone, it will not do so equally. The divide between rich and poor countries and people that have access to resources and those that don't is growing. And I'm using rich and poor in purely economic terms. Of course, we know that capitalism has skewed completely our understanding of wealth and worth and rich and poor. But just to say, developing countries and people that live in them are already facing the brunt of the climate crisis. They're having to move, they're facing famine, they are having extreme weather effects that are killing thousands and hundreds of thousands of people yearly. And this is another result of the capitalist system we live under today, because it's a system based on the exploitation of one by another, of the wealthiest of the wealthy, of the ruling class over the working class, or of the rich countries over the developing countries. The United Nations has written extensively about this disproportionate impact of climate change already. Global temperature rising and sea levels rising and ocean acidification and precipitation patterns mean that people living in poverty are the most severely impacted, they say. Since climate affects everything from where a person can live to access their health care, millions of people could be plunged further into poverty as environmental conditions worsen. This is especially true for poor people living in low-income countries. Just as climate change deepens inequalities within a country, it also further stratifies international relations because some nations are more threatened by it than others. And poor countries have fewer resources to deal with the problem. There's also the important fact that the world's 2,153 richest billionaires, 2,153 people, have more wealth today than 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. And this is a number that has been increasingly growing as far as the smaller number of people at the top and the larger amount of people at the bottom. Again, this is the capitalist system we live under. This is the result of the capitalist system. And so all of that is kind of disheartening. It can seem really big. It can be overwhelming. It is something that I think it's also important, though, that we understand that just because we know these facts or we think about them doesn't mean that anyone who hears them will take action. And I think what is most important to say after looking at the planet this way and understanding it is to say that we do have a way to confront the climate crisis. We do have the tools that we need to build a mass movement for climate justice, for Indigenous rights, against racism, against all of the ills that also are more signs of the system that we live under today. In Canada, as in the United States, we live in countries that have the world's biggest ecological footprint at the expense of the vast majority of the world. And therefore, we have the most responsibility to change rapidly, to fight for the world that we know is possible, and to stand against these corrupt policies by the governments of Canada and the United States that we live under. From here in British Columbia and within Climate Convergence, we work to and we understand that we must support all actions taken for our planet. We support actions locally here in British Columbia as we continue to strive for an international climate justice movement that is united across borders and recognizes the fundamental human rights are self-determination, alongside access to food and water and housing and education. For this, we also know that climate justice movement must have a long view. The situation is dire and it is urgent, but it's also something that means that we have to take what we're doing very seriously and work together to build the mass movement that we need. We need a network of local struggles, and we need to be connected and coordinate our work together to build an effective protest movement. We also need to articulate the world that we want to live in, a world where we live, not just exist, a world where we relate to each other and to nature completely differently than the system that we are currently living under. I think it's important, and I wanted to just read a few quotes to kind of end off. I realize that I've thrown many ideas out there, and I look forward to our discussion and our continued work. But I will say that I was reading again Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and I know there's been a lot of very good things written since then. And yeah, I wanted just to describe something relating to an important another feature, I think, of the capitalist system we live under, which is our alienation from nature. The fact that nature can be seen as a resource to be exploited, and the system we live under has been based on the exploitation of nature, has really separated ourselves from that nature. And we can go for walks here in British Columbia. We can feel very close to nature in a lot of ways, but still our daily lives, the way that we earn, we are forced to earn money, to spend our labor, and to buy things is all very counter nature. And in 1854, Henry David Thoreau described it as, "The laboring man has not leisure for a true integrity day by day. He cannot afford to sustain the manliest relations to men. His labor would be depreciated in the market. He has no time to be anything but a machine." And then I also wanted to bring in a quote from Joe Covell, who is one of the formulators and originators of the idea of eco-socialism. He has a book called The 5 Theses on Eco-Socialism, and describes in many ways throughout the book the way that we must fundamentally, kind of as Lee was explaining too, we have to be open to rethinking the world as we've been taught. And one of those fundamental lessons that we've been told over and over is that the capitalist system we live under is the system that humans were meant to live under, that will always live under, and it's it's like perfection defined. It is how we are going to be forever, when in reality, the world we live under is dynamic and ever-changing and is not going to stay the same, and is definitely not always been this way. So Joe Covell, in many ways, talks about how capitalism is not human nature. And in one quote, he says, "Capitalism is the first system of production in the history of the world where exchange value rules over use value." Exchange value can be conceived as human need, and use value is how we can describe something that is what its price is, how much profit can you make from it. So he says, "Capitalism is the first system of production in the history of the world where exchange value rules over use value. Its whole history and culture may be seen from this perspective. which requires that money rules the economy and that the economy rules over society, subordinating humanity and nature to the logic of accumulation. But that's not the way it has to be. The last quote I'll end with, because I think it's important to end with quotes that are optimistic and show us the way forward, is that of Fidel Castro. In 1992, at the Rio Summit, Fidel Castro, the former president and revolutionary leader of Cuba, which in 2006 was declared the only country in the world with a sustainable footprint by the World Wildlife Federation, explained the situation of the world in 1992, which is not so different than today. He said, he said, an important biological species, humankind, is at risk of disappearing due to the rapid and progressive elimination of its natural habitat. We are becoming aware of this problem when it is almost too late to prevent it. It must be said that consumer societies are chiefly responsible for this appalling environmental destruction. They respond by the former colonial metropolis. They are the offspring of imperial policies, which in turn brought forth the backwardness and poverty that have become the scourge for the great majority of humankind.
God, I hate that word.
And ends with, enough of selfishness, enough of schemes of domination, enough of insensitivity, irresponsibility, and deceit. Tomorrow it will be too late to do what we should have done a long time ago. That's where I'm ending.
Thank you very much, Alison. And thank you again to Jennifer and to Lee for their presentations beforehand. We are going to get into the question and answer section. So just a reminder to people that you can put your questions into the question and answer box or the chat box. And the people, and then I'll make sure that they get answered, or if you type it in on Facebook, we'll do our best to make sure that we can transfer those as well. Before we get into that part and giving people some time to ask questions, just to remind people that Climate Convergence is an open grassroots climate justice organization. We meet every second Wednesday. So next Wednesday, we'll be meeting at 7 p.m. on Zoom. If you're interested in acting on anything that you're hearing tonight, we would love to have you. We are focused on very specific local goals, fighting against the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and Site C Dam. But as this forum is part of, we're very interested in opening up the broader political discussions and talking about the better world that we know that we all need to live in, and that is possible. And I think part of one of the important points that I try and remind myself, and I think is always worth reminding everybody, is that the way we're living doesn't have to be inevitable. The world and human development, and definitely the planet's development, is full and requires change. And so much has happened in the last 200 years. And we're still stuck with the same crappy economy that played a productive role a long time ago, but right now means that all sorts of nonsensical things that are literally going to destroy us if we don't get it under grips are happening. So if we're open to change and progress and development on everything else, I think on the economy would be a good place to start and to look into and be as critical and driven about those kind of possibilities as we are about all of the others. The first question that we have was for Jennifer Nathan. It is, what is the tar sands oil? Where is the tar sands oil primarily going? As in, what industries or countries are guzzling up so much of it?
That's a good question. You probably saw with all the promotion, we must build the pipeline to get a fair market value for our resource. So they were thinking there were these Asian markets, which have not I'm not sure if they're going to materialize, but again, you have to remember that Kenny took teacher pension money and invested it into Keystone XL. Remember that? Even though they knew Biden was going to cancel it as soon as he got in, which he did. So there's not a lot of sort of reality about where they think the markets are and where they might be. But, so Kenny has sort of said the last barrel of oil used in the world should be a Canadian barrel. And I remember when they were sort of talking about, how can we stop this pipeline? And he looked at things like, well, I would hope they would fail on Indigenous consultation, but it didn't. And then the NDP said, well, let's use the financial argument, it'll fail on that. But what if the countries of the world don't try to keep within the planetary boundaries of where our mission should be, and they do, say, have a demand for it in Asia, then it's going to be a problem because that production level will go up and they will use the pipeline. They are building it. We're watching it happening. So one thing we asked the National Energy Board to do was to look at emissions and how the emissions from Canada would fit into that 1.5 budget, and they never did it. So again, as Alison said, money rules over the economy, and we can just, I guess, just kind of hope that that market does not materialize because we haven't looked at emissions. So yeah, Biden's saying now we're going to have a 50% reduction. If they actually do it, most of our oil right now is going to the States. So maybe we'll lose our market. Maybe there'll be no demand. So we can just kind of cross our fingers, but I really wish that the emissions argument would shut it down more than hope.
Fair. And just to continue on that question, someone's asking about the Liberals' reliance on net zero using carbon capture and storage, fossil fuel, hydrogen, energy production, and small modular nuclear power. So not cutting energy production, but finding these different kind of hacks for it.
Exactly. And again, that paper sort of shows that the climate scientists are quite aware that that is a ruse. It's a technology that's not proven and not at that scale. And that all the climate scientists are saying we just must bring our emissions down. Carbon capture, if you're going to use it, could be things for cement where you can't get rid of that thing, but we could kind of shut down the demand side of oil. That's one of the things we can do, which would bring down emissions. So yeah, carbon capture at that end, won't do it. So again, only brings it down to the production level, not at the downstream. So once we ship it out of the country, 85% of the emissions will be burned there.
Alison, is that your hand up?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think it's also, it's really the shell game that they play about emissions in developing countries, but a lot of the times in Canada or the US especially, is they don't count the burning of the oil that flows through the pipeline against Canada's emissions. So Canada can say, Jason Kenney has this idea, it's like the cleanest pipelines, because we're going to start pumping the oil out of the ground with natural gas in some cases, like they're trying to say it's better than everywhere else, but Canada doesn't have to count any of the fuel that gets burned and emits into the atmosphere. It's like they don't understand, or it's they refuse to believe that we only have one atmosphere on Earth, that there's not borders in the sky that somehow mean that the pollution anywhere else doesn't affect us. So it's like, it's very, it's just a total shell game about emissions, and something that they don't want people to think about or consider the impact of oil coming out of Canada and what that means.
They don't want them to be considerate.
Yeah.
That's what I'm calling for. Let's be considerate. Let's consider everything. It's ridiculous. Trudeau said something really stupid about a month ago on Facebook, and Sinclair gave him a good licking. I was so proud of him that day. He starts talking about, you Indigenous people that are wearing modern clothes, you've already capitulated to the enemy. And so you don't deserve any of what you're asking for. That's the same as the rest of the world. That's his attitude. That's what he's bringing to the table. That's the ultimate in conquest-based racism, and it's global in his mind. He's a very wealthy man. And he didn't get there by sharing.
And Lee, I'm hoping that maybe you could comment a bit more about, of course, like we look at kind of history and we see when Indigenous nations assert their right to their land and their self-determination, huge militarization like at COHA, or now currently with at Wet'suwet'en, and those kinds of struggles, like why that level of violence and why that level of like concern when Indigenous people started to assert their rights in Canada, why you think the Canadian government is so concerned, and what we can do as far as people who are supporting that struggle.
First of all, I think Canadians have to figure out what do I want to look at 100 years from now? What do my children want to look at? What do my grandchildren want to look at? That's how we view things. When I first had a child, I didn't want my child going to school learning that his ancestors or her ancestors were barbaric and ate each other. That's what I learned. I went and asked my ta'a, who was 100 years old, did you eat anybody? She said, I don't think we did, or my I would have taught me how best to cook them. We don't have any recipes for them. That's just as simple as that. Like, logic should tell you something, but this is not a logic-based country. We're spirit-to-spirit logicians, Indigenous people. And it's not difficult to transform yourself into that kind of person. You don't have to be Indigenous to understand that you're a spirit-to-spirit logician, to wrap your mind around that if I take this stone and dash this little bee, he's not going to pollinate. He's not going to do that little dance. He'll get all those other bees pollinating the flowers. If I destroy the wild flowers of this continent, the bees are going to starve. We have half-starved bees all over the world. So if you think you're going to keep eating like we are, forget the caviar, man. We're going to be scraping up the grass like cows because we are not taking care and we're not being considerate. I don't even remember your question, but that is the message that I want everybody in this country to get. Costerton CPAS wanted you to get it. Capilano wanted you to get it. People at Passamaquoddy wanted you to get it. The Rarumida wanted you to get it. The last woman, the Mi'kmaq people wanted you to get it. You're not getting it. It is going to take looking around and seeing the vastness of this country. Look at the size of this land we have and the paucity of trees and animal life. Imagine killing millions and millions and millions of those beautiful buffalo. Here's what happened to my granddaughter. We went to this farm to get some buffalo meat. And this big bull comes along, doo-doo, doo-doo, and the farmer says, you better get her away from that fence. She was 2. And I says, no, he won't hurt her. I looked at him, I saw him, and he was coming for her. He took his huge nose and touched it to her little button and stared at her for 10 seconds. Then he turned around and walked away, and he said, I've never seen anything like that. He was taking pictures and going crazy. She's considerate. That buffalo knew she was considerate. He recognized her. The animals want this to happen. The land wants this to happen. The invisible beings. You know what happens when you clear cut a forest? All those deadly viruses and bacteria let loose. Where do you think COVID came from? China's been clear cutting only for 30 years, and look what happened. That's where that disease come from. The hantavirus in California is from clear cutting. We're going to get more and more of this kind of illnesses. And at a certain point, we're going to be an endangered species ourselves. And then maybe we'll straighten up and fly right. Because it's about being considerate. It's about being considerate. I think the best thing a person could do is live a life where you don't go into Walmart to buy a new t-shirt ever again. That would be such a reduction in your carbon footprint. That would be such a statement. And that every time you meet somebody on the street, you know, I don't shop at Walmart. I tell everybody I can, I don't shop at Walmart. I got this at Value Village. You know what? The energy was already used. It takes nothing to make this. Almost no carbon footprint to make this shirt for me. It cost a lot for someone else. I don't know how many times it's been circulated. It's a nice shirt, probably 10 or 11 times. But if we keep circulating the clothes from as old as we are to our future generations and not buying new. I ask my students all the time, how many t-shirts do you own and how many pairs of shoes? You know what I get over average after 25 years of teaching? 10 pairs of shoes. 10 pairs of shoes. That's boys included. They got 10 pairs of shoes. What the hell? You only got 2 feet. You only got 2 feet. How many cows is that? How many cows is that? How many cows does it take to make a pair of shoes? I think you ought to think about that. I think you ought to think about how many children it takes to make those pairs of shoes. And that we need to realize that capitalism is about this. I got this. It's a toonie, and if I take this toonie and buy some flour and make a cake, I can sell it for 2 toonies. We're not sharing when that happens. We're being inconsiderate to the person we're feeding. We're fleecing them of these toonies, and these toonies come out of the ground. It's metal. And yet there we are over and over again. We're not thinking futuristically, and we're not thinking backward either. Hindsight. You know how this capitalism was born? A bunch of children in England died for it. Don't forget that. The Industrial Revolution was a killing machine of British children. And then they dumped them onto a bunch of ships, and they sent them here to kill other people. And then they took a bunch of Africans from Africa, and they sent them over here to kill them in the cotton fields. It's just been killing people for a half a millennia. And it's killed animals, untold animals, for whales, for perfume, because somebody didn't want to wash. Queen Elizabeth bathed once a year, whether she needed or not, but she went through whale after whale for her perfume. Honestly, there has never been such a sick social formation as capitalism. It has dehumanized us all and killed so many beautiful beings. Beautiful beings. I was in that sound. 2,500 whales surrounded our boat. I don't know if you remember that, Victoria. And my daughter and I started singing, and this whale stood up. He started singing back at us. And then eventually he breached, and they all took off. And I said to my daughter, I think they're having a meeting. I really do. They're talking about us. They got plans. They're not stupid. And we have to consider that. And that's all I got to say about that.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we ask all the speakers to do their last wrap-up statements. I want to thank everybody who's tuning in tonight. And remind everybody we've posted the links for how to get involved. The next meeting We really need to keep fighting. Like people were saying, like we're talking about something really important, but fighting and organizing about it is even more important. So please make sure you try to do that. Also, there's a link to a book that I wrote called System Change, Not Climate Change in the comments if you're interested. Thank you. And I just, I want to thank the speakers as well. We knew we wanted to organize this webinar. We knew this was a topic we wanted to discuss, but we weren't exactly sure who the best speakers were, but it turned out excellently. We were really happy to get this. And yeah, sending the email and the Facebook message to Lee was kind of a Hail Mary, but it worked out great. And Jennifer was just calling me up to talk to me and try and get me involved in something she was doing about the tar sands, and said, well, why don't you speak about it in a webinar? And Alison is a really consistent organizer with Climate Convergence, so it really came together. And Kelly, we're so thankful to have you. After the speakers do their last statements, hopefully you can end it in a good way. And so let's go in order, if that's all right. Jennifer, do you have anything to final words, how to stay connected, or what you want people to know? You're muted, Jennifer.
Wow.
You're good now.
So I guess just get involved and stay on what's happening and talk about it. I think one of the things that the oil sands gets away with, and I even heard an energy economist say, don't bother fighting the pipeline because in the name of national unity. The story's crumbling. So I think we need to start talking about it and letting people know what is the reality of our climate situation, and that we just have to make these changes. And what you can do at a local level and a federal level, whatever you can do. And yeah, and I think stay in with Climate Convergence as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And Lee, if you could do some final words, and then if there's anything that's going on out east that we should be aware of. We're really aware of kind of Trans Mountain and more local struggles, but if there's anything going on in your neck of the woods that you think would be important for us to see.
Oh, right now I'm finishing 2 books, so yeah, I got my head in a computer, but I just did a really good piece of work with my conversations with Canadians, but I'm primarily a writer now, and I'm not as active as I used to be. So, but people still are doing things in Ontario. I don't think people here are as active though as they are in British Columbia. British Columbia is an interesting place. It's always been quite dichotomous. You know, the activism has always been very strong. In fact, whole towns in the Salish territory were started up by socialists who were leaving Europe. I don't know if you know that about BC's history, but there's a lot of left-wing people in British Columbia. And there's also a lot of really selfish people. But here, I think people are more inward looking and less inclined to look outward. Although, you know, I do try to change that in my classes. I try to get my students to actually evaluate themselves and their impact on the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. And we're very much looking forward to your next 2 books, for real.
Yeah.
Please get them out sooner rather than later.
Mink is telling the story. We do have a trickster. It's a mink, not a raven.
We'll look forward to it.
The story of Canada.
Awesome. And then Alison, if you could wrap up, and then we'll do the thank yous and goodbyes.
Yeah, no, thank you again to everyone tonight. I think that we are living, like we said, in a time that is urgent and is critical, but also at a time that we can see the kind of the system that we live under is exposed more than it's ever been before in my short lifetime and my, you know, my viewpoint. It's something that COVID-19 and the pandemic has exposed such extreme inequality in the world. It has exposed the interests of governments in creating more profit and bringing economies way over human need. And like I had said before, it's really shown the delicate balance between the animal world and humans and nature, and how ruptured it is right now. And I think that we have to see that as an opportunity, and I know that we do, in the sense of taking what people can see in their everyday lives and working as hard as we can so that people can see how that's related to planetary destruction, how that's related then to the fact that on any given day in Canada, 100 reserves don't have access to clean water in 2021, and that's somehow not an urgent government priority, yet building a pipeline that carries oil that's going to be burned and contribute to climate catastrophe is important enough to keep going and keep building during the pandemic, at the risk to workers' lives and at the risk to people living in the areas where these projects are taking place. We saw crises come in the form of pandemic outbreaks in remote areas of British Columbia, most often Indigenous reserves, because of workers coming in to work on these projects. And I think many people can't and don't want to ignore that anymore. And we have to build on that in order to be prepared to build the movement that we need to save the planet. I mean, diversity and an unknowable amount of animal and plant diversity has been lost under the capitalist system. Millions of people have been killed, and we won't get that back, ever. But it's definitely important to fight as hard as we can for this better world that we know is possible, and that we do unite together from across nations and all around the world. Sorry, there was just a crazy sound. We got it. Thank you. It was every devastating piece of news that we read is really a call to action from Mother Earth, and we can do this together. We can build a more united and stronger anti-capitalist international climate justice movement together, and we have the wisdom and the knowledge. And Lee, we're just so lucky to have you here with us tonight, and we'll continue our work together in the future.
Right.
Thank you, Alison. I think I was muted there. I don't know how I was making that sound. But before we get to Kelly, again, thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate it. And we want this, we know the problems are big, but we're really convinced that it's worthwhile doing something. And by showing up for a webinar like this, we're sure you're thinking the same way as well, because you wouldn't be bothering to come to a webinar. You wouldn't be bothered to be concerned if you didn't think there was a possibility to improve it. And that's what we're here to do. And capitalism wastes so much human potential. We spend so much energy on things that we don't need, so much energy on things that are destructive, so much energy on things that do not serve ourselves or the planet. And we have a whole world of 7 billion people, and most of us would be greatly served by uniting and working together and improving things. And all that human potential that hasn't been tapped yet, if it were really focused towards human development and towards nurturing and community and building the things that really matter. It's incredible what is still possible if we get it right. And there's still that chance. So I hope we can all work on towards that together. Kelly, could you unmute yourself and send us off in a good way, please?
Are there now?
Yeah, thank you.
Did
I
somebody
can hear
get
you.
it? Hi, Chikosi. Such crucial messages to be shared, and thanks for participants for joining in, and the knowledge that got to the panel today probably was hard earned, and we appreciate that wealth of centuries of knowledge in such a short time. And thank you for your preparations, panel and organizers. Hi, Chikosi. Having our participants from Beothuk to as far west on the Salish Sea Island was amazing. Even Semiahmoo, as far south as our relatives in the northern ones. So great assembly here. See many of the participants are experts in their own ways, in their own rights, and great consideration for the panels to express themselves. So much appreciation for the expert participants out there too, because it's a good lesson for us to hear one another out, and expression of appreciations for climate convergence, brothers and sisters helping one another. I just wanted to say at the end of Lee's during her presentation, almost a 3/4 of a circle rainbow formed around the sun here in the west. And the last time I saw a rainbow like that, 3 rainbows went through us, right through our bodies, and never been the same since. I really believe in their essence, even that they are radioactive light because of what we all do to the earth. I really believe those lights are telling us or helping us somehow.
Yeah.
The circle ended yellow and light purple with ALISON speaking, and at the end once it was still a full rainbow at the end of the deliveries. The circle was mainly pale yellow and pale mauve. The color was 2 of the theme colors of our missing murdered women. And I can't believe it. I wish I had a camera. A turtle formed in a dark cloud at the bottom at the end of Thomas's presentation. So I believe the clouds and them, they watch us and they look at us, and they're a part of our breath. And I believe we're going to do climate convergence change because of who we are and where we've been and where we're going to go to. And having experience of hearing the panelists out of the generations that they're involved in, grateful for that knowledge and accepting of that knowledge with our participants. Expression of appreciation to our millions of people all over the world that are not living because of the profit making for the almighty dollar at the sacrifice of the right to life of the sacred Mother Earth. Invite all to take a look at UNDRIP. Wasn't mentioned here, but Article 22 looks mainly at supporting women's groups, and the first articles talk lead up to the supporting the rivers as an entity, as a living being. We need to be doing that exercise. I understand Lee saying that we are the trees we are. And the trees, the rivers are created from the trees who we are also. Mene Wichoni, we are the water for life. Talilo Estelo, it is good that the Oyate, the people, Tahanche, Nuia, the brothers and sisters helping one another in this regard. In hundreds of us gathered as foster care in the 60s that were dispersed for profit of mainly colonizers, and we were children slaves of the churches, and then now when there was hundreds of us in Vancouver area, early 70s, to end up to be 5,000 of us to roaming in the early mid 70s in the States from North, Central, and South America. That was the creation of UNDRIP. And we didn't know at the time. And the old folks, we called the old folks, they were 19, 20 years old. So I'm floored that our leadership was that like 16, 17 years old, the ones doing things. getting the message to the mayors, getting the message to the MLAs and the MPs. I influence you all to take the crucial messages that you've heard this evening to your mayor, to your MLA, to your MP. Be active. It's great to have that information ingrained in your brain, but share it. You know, knock those MPs over with the information they already know it's their job to do, to protect all living beings. Tell them, you know, take a look at UNDRIP and support that. We are not the problem of the world. Thank the Indigenous people of the world, specifically here, for upholding the many countries that have come here, ran away for centuries for freedom here. And thank the Indigenous people, even though being slaughtered, holding our hand out for help, being slaughtered for making medicine and helping those to survive, to this day, still being slaughtered, as was aforementioned by our prestigious speakers. Do yourself a favor. Look at your mayor with great honor and prestige, and MLA and MP, encourage them to stand up. Don't live on the knees of the corporate destruction. Remove the abusers. It's possible. One person at a time. Go see your mayor, MLA, MP, Haichka CM, for lending us that twinkle of a spark of light from the star knowledge of your brains this evening. In respects to the participants, carrying your messages with our panel, and those messages to the Eagles back from the Lilwat Nation. Share our Eagle song in closing, as well as in the opening of this umbilical cord this evening that will move mayors, MLAs, MPs forward to address, acknowledge climate change. Our Eagle song of Lilwat. Climate justice change. We are the cleansing of the umbilical cord of the sacred Mother Earth. We thank you for the privilege of being responsible, considerate this evening to move forward with the words of wisdom shared this evening. We thank the Creator for the blessing of CM, our relatives, with their crucial messages this evening. CM, we thank the Creator for the participants, for their crucial ears and their mouths to move in a good manner that will make change. The umbilical cord cleanses. Then we grow up and move. Help your mayors, MLAs, and MPs move and cleanse that cord. They know what to do. You need that push, push them. Thank the Creator for the will of the mind, body, and soul, for those that shared their knowledge to help us to move, become awake, to help the sacred Mother Earth and the swimmers the flyers, the four-leggeds that can't speak for themselves. Thank you so much for heart, mind, body, and soul strength, our panelists, our coordinators, and our participants for making this day worthwhile. Haitska CM, thank you, our relatives. CIM, the spirit within you, that is the change. Haitska CM, helping us become awake to help this beautiful country. All my relations, respect,
Wait.
the highest honor to every one of you, healing our nations of united resistance to apathy. All my relations. Haitska CM.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you very much to Lee, to Jennifer, to Allison, and everybody who came out tonight. Please go out, do whatever you can to make the world a better place, and whatever you can do to stay connected with others to do that, the better. So we'll be in touch, and we'll see everybody at the next one. Thank you very much.
Yay.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you, Kelly.
Love you so much.
Love you too. Thank you, ladies. I'm going now.